right, let's get started. So we're on chapter 4, the colors of Eros. Cuba as an American obsession. Eros, the ancient Greek god of carnal love. 2, physical love, desire. 3, psychoanal. A, the libido. B, instance for self-preservation and collectively. Cuba, like Panama, has been an object of unwanted attention from U.S. interventionist policymakers. Unique to Cuba, however, is its historical role as an exotic locale for the U.S. immigration imagination. Before 1959, as the site of American fantasies and fetish around a dark or sensuous culture, Cuba and its inhabitants were exploited and commodified in gambling, prostitutions, and tourism, regulated by organized crime that contribute to the gross national product. Today, films such as The Mambo King and The Mask encourage audiences to long for the nostalgic romantic Cuba, where, as with the mythical sexualized black, one finds and imbibes carnality and possession and passion. In the sovereign state such as Cuba, the only remaining socialist state in the hemisphere, one also finds other forms of eros, including tenacious instincts for self-preservation. It is this form of libido that has so sensed some U.S. policymakers who encounter a political will that belies the image of the passionate Hindustanic Latin. I have no idea what that word is. Let me go look it up. As soon as it lets me highlight it. Right back. Means engage in a pursuit of pleasure, sensual self-indulgence. So turning Cuba into just this huge resort. Hellenistic Latin. U.S. destabilization, Cuban resistance. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an economic embargo against Cuba, warns the U.S. State Department of Treasury announcement detailing travel restrictions for U.S. citizens and residents. Right, Gabriel Garcia Marquez describes the blockade's initial effect on Cuba's dependency. Here he goes. That night, the first of the blockade, there were in Cuba some 482,550 cars, 348,300 refrigerators, 549,700 radios, 303,500 TV sets, 350,900 electric irons, 288,400 fans, 41,800 washing machines, 3,510,000 wristwatches, 63 locomotives, 12 merchant ships. All these except the watches, which were Swiss, were made in the United States. Prohibiting all trade to and trade with Cuba, as well as tourism and business ventures, the United States pressures other governments and international institutions to deny credit to Cuba. American citizens engaged in research or academic exchanges are permitted to travel, with the latest travel restrictions imposed in 1994. However, educators and journalists must fulfill bureaucratic requirements, including the submission of curriculum, vitae, and research proposals. The blockade makes it difficult to receive phone calls from the United States, and mail from there is also unreliable. The obstruction of intellectual exchange restricts the speech of Cuban politicians, educators, and intellectuals, and artists in the United States. Given the embargo and travel restrictions, the U.S. public relies on mainstream media for information and coverage. Often these report instructions construct images of Cuba that are based on the White House and State Department communiques. Few mainstream media sources routinely depict the historical and contemporary U.S. destabilization of Cuba and its impact on the social and governmental practices on the island. Although the United States has established diplomatic and economic relations with former U.S. state Communist China and Communist Vietnam, Cuba is its last Cold War target for punitive economic policies. The 33-year-old anti-Cuba trade embargo was intensified by a 1992 bill introduced by Robert Terracilla, Democratic person, New Jersey, which prohibited foreign subsidiaries of U.S. corporations to engage in business transactions with Cuba. The blockade produced extensive food and medicine shortages. Even Oxfam of America is considering providing assistance, as National Public Radio reported on May 23, 1995. International Foundations for Community Organization, IFCO, Pastors for Peace, and other religious and civic organizations have denounced the embargo as a form of economic warfare and as intervention into the affairs of a sovereign nation, a violation of international law and U.S. treaties. According to an IFCO Pastor for Peace newsletter, in the November 1993 UN condemnation of the embargo, which stemmed from a vote of 84-4. Only Albania, Israel, and Paraguay, quote, none of these considered champions of human rights, voted with the United States. Congressional members have joined activists in organizing to lift the embargo. Democratic House of Representative Charles Rangel's Free Trade with Cuba Act, H.R. 2229, calls for lifting the embargoes and has 32 co-sponsors. Pastor of Peace, the Veceramos Brigades, the Radical Philosophers Association, and the Cuban Information Project, among other groups, provided opportunities for North Americans to learn about the nation. And although this is becoming more difficult with increasing U.S. restrictions to travel there to understand more about Cuban society and the impact of the embargo on Cuban lives, conservative projections of the United States as a legitimate intervener seeking to democratize Cubans problematized lifting the blockade, even though progressives such as the group cited above, as well as media and corporate leaders, increasingly suggest that measures as the only rational policy. Activists have practiced civil disobedience by intentionally breaking the blockade. In 1994, Pastors of Peace transported medicines and supplies in a caravan from the northern United States to Mexico to be shipped to Cuba. Having detained the caravan at the Laredo border, federal agents, following the hunger strike by clergies in Lati finally allowed the caravan to travel into Mexico, where its cargo was shipped on to Cuba. In addition to the embargoes and blockade, U.S. destabilization of Cuba has ranged from the State Department's 1960 harassment of the Cuban UN delegation of the 1963 failed military invasion of the Bay of Pigs, as well as the alleged covert U.S. support for Omega 7, a terrorist organization of Cuba's exiles, which in the 1970s were linked to the assassination attempt directed at Fidel Castro and the downing of the Cuban airliners and the deaths of its passengers. The United States still illegally occupies Guantanamo Bay, and at its military base there, military personnel detain Cuban boat people. Let me do something real quick. I need to... Hold on. I can't tell. I'll just... There we go. Sorry, buddy. In June 1994, Cuba updated editor Sandra Levinson noted that the embargo and the United States' refusal to issue permanent visas to Cubans seeking to enter this country participate dangerously confrontations. For example, Levinson report that, quote, 100 Cubans broke into the Belgian embassy in Havana seeking asylum. Cubans were injured or arrested when the military police attempted to stop the hijack of boats and planes. 2 leaders of the recently formed exile group, Commandos F4, were arrested in Miami for attempting to purchase, quote, a Stinger missile and other advanced weapons to launch an attack against Cuba, end quote. Levinson maintained the normal diplomatic relations with Cuba would have prevented these occurrences. Normal diplomatic relations, however, have not existed for nearly a century. In 1898, after a 3-year war of independence, Cuba defeated Spanish colonizers, only to have their country immediately occupied by the United States, postponing the national liberation victory until 1959. For half a century, the U.S. occupation and, quote, administration of Cuba worked to convert the islands into a plantation for U.S. sugar corporations and Havana into a mafia-controlled tourist playground internationally renowned for its prostitutions and gambling. Before 1959, the Cuban majority, particularly darker-skinned Cubans, and women struggled for subsistence as impoverished illiterates. Most served foreign and local elites for prospered under the repressive United States-backed Batista government. After the success of the second anti-colonial struggle, the revolutionary government implemented comprehensive health care, free and universal education, social security, and free and subsidized housing to address post-revolution expectations for better living standards. The Cuban government financed its redistribution of wealth by nationalizing and the holdings of and property of U.S. corporations and affluent Cubans who immigrated to the United States. Many local elites, white and affluent Cubans, fled the island for the United States during and after the revolution. Largely professionals and middle class, those who fled the revolution were criticized not only for their refusal to stay and build a more just society, but also for they used the dark thing, or Haitianizing the island by leaving the Cuban version of white flight with Miami and New Jersey as U.S. suburban havens. In the early years of the new society, Cuba sought political and economic ties with many nations, especially the United States. Fixated on its defeat by the national liberation struggle waged by, and at the time, non-communist rebels, the United States rejected Cubans' reconciliatory overtures and imposed an embargo and blockade. With the Cold War and a neo-Monroe Doctrine manifest destiny policy.
السلام عليكم.
Salaikum salam.
بارك الله بيك يا أخي.
The United States cut diplomatic and economic ties. The Soviet Union filled the void, becoming the newly independent nation, political and economic pillar. Cuba's pre-revolution economic dependency on the United States faded. 90 miles from Florida's coast, the former site of U.S. militarism and tourism became a U.S. parlance, a Soviet satellite. Representations of Cuba as an appendage of Eastern Europe communism furthered the embargo and blockade. At times, ideological posturing led to a near cataclysm, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis during Kennedy's administration. Since the fall of the Soviet constellations, U.S. state disclosure was continued to represent Cuba as a communist satellite, although no configuration of communist states varying for its allegiance exists. Before the Soviet demise, Cuba attained the highest standard of living in Latin America, in spite of the U.S. embargoes, supported by its trade with former socialist Eastern European countries. It escaped the devastating underdevelopment of developing nations. They use third world, by the way, which we penalized by debt crisis and International Monetary Fund austerities measures. Unlike others in the region, Cubans enjoyed a high life expectancy rate, 73.4 years, comparable to the U.S. average and exceeding the life expectancies of Native and African Americans in the United States. Cuba also developed one of the highest literacy rates in the Americas, 96%, with the ninth grade as the average educational attainment, surpassing the U.S. literacy rate. Urban Cubans' expectations and desires around consumerism and materialism were rarely constrained by the notion of being a developing world country, much less a colony. Cuba's stands Cuban standing was that of a second worlder, able to best some first world nations, including the United States, by providing comprehensive social services for its population, and even defeating destabilization attempts from the most formidable first worlder. In his 1994 keynote address to the Sixth Conference of North America and Cuban Philosophers and Social Scientists at the University of Havana, economist Alonso Casanova reported that in the 1980s, Cuba was the only Latin American country to increase its per capita gross material product by 33%. In 1983, with a strong economy, Cuba was 75th in the United Nations Human Index for quality of life in respect to education, health, culture, and social stability. Cuba's workforce was considered to be one of the healthiest, most qualified, and literate labor force in Latin America and in the Caribbean. That all changed in the late 1980s. Today, social services have collapsed. Consumers' desire can no longer be met, and discontent runs high. According to Casanova, Cuba's economic structures, quote, have not been good at producing wealth, but excellent at redistributing it. Central planning gave Cuba the most developed technological society in the developing world. Excellent highways and port facilities augment a textile industry capable of producing textiles for 40 million people, and a construction industry able to produce more than 60 million tons of oil per year, trading 4 million tons of sugar for 12 million tons of refined oil annually. Cuba geared its economy for producing sugar for barter trade with Eastern European countries. The cost of producing oil and sugar were considerably irrelevant because of the fixed market or barter system between states. Productivity and quality were also not pressing concerns for the trading nations because of the guaranteed market. stated Casanova. As the Soviet bloc disintegrated in the late 1980s, so did the Cuban economy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, Cuba was capitulated into what is now called its, quote, special period, end quote, during which scarcity and hardship were intensified by the U.S. embargoes and blockade. So again, not Cuba's fault. For Cuban writer Reynaldo Gonzalez, it's easy. However, the special period was, quote, was before the crisis and not now, when we Cubans have been returned without appeal to our conditions as a developing world country. In general, Cubans are adapting. For example, in medicines, more people are resorting to herbal and homeopathic alternatives, treating such as acupunctures in place of anesthesia. Through the 1989 crash, Cuba lost 80% of its raw materials and 85% of its foreign trade, 90% of which was in rum, tobacco, and sugar, and 10% in electronics, pharmaceuticals, and chemical products. Its decades of dependency on Eastern Europe technology left few spare parts or replacements for machinery. Between 1991 and 1994, for instance, more than 50% of Cuba's industrial facilities were closed. Unable to receive aid, Cuba's foreign debt principal, 7.5 billion, remained fixed as its interest increases from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The blockade makes converting the economy and technological and industrial equipment a tremendous feat without capital. Post-1959, Cuba depended heavily on sugarcane as an economic mainstay. The first U.S. Venceremos Brigade of U.S. progressive supporting Cuba's independency worked to harvest the sugar fields as a sign of political solidarity as well as economic support. Increasing trade with China, an estimate of 420 million in 1994, exporting sugars for bicycles and technology, as mitigated the loss of the Eastern European market. Cuba was also developed economic alternatives to sugar production. Its genetic engineering industry is considered to be one of the most economically successful ventures, although the dominant economic ventures of tourism. Despite this endeavor, the need for most Cuban citizens are not met. For example, Cubans' universal ration book used to guarantee certain amount of beans, rice, eggs, fish, meat, and household necessity for everyone, whether they could or would work. With the current shortages and illegal marketeering, however, food supplies are now often depleted before the end of the month. Cuba's free healthcare system is hampered by inadequate medicines and supplies. Cubans spend months without toothpaste and bathing soap. There is acute rationing of gasoline for cars, and often 12 consecutive hours of blackouts. Some neighborhoods go without electricity for days. Milk previously available to school children to the age of 14 is now only available to those 7 and younger. Although it still provides to adults over 55 years old. In the countryside, people's access to gardens, oxen, and horse-drawn carts means fewer food and fuel shortages. Several with dignity and problematized by gender roles. As in the United States, women are the mainstay of the Cuban family. Overwhelmingly, women struggle with the effects of the special period of Cuban families. During the times of scarcity and economic instability, the burdens of coping with inadequate supplies of food, domestic goods, and transportation, which largely fall on women who manage households and raise children, intensified. Fuel and food scarcities, water shortages, stoppage, and difficulty in finding children's shoes and clothing have made domestic life a nightmare for many women. Casa de las Margeries y las Familias as women's centers have been formed to help city women meet to discuss and find solutions to their new domestic problems. Although Cuba has a law that makes it a social crime for men to not share in household duties and child rearing, it is difficult both to enforce it and to make men understand that they have to share in the reproduction of the family as well. Cuban women note that local planning boards are still not responsive enough to community needs. Typically, the Cuban woman is also held responsible for the state's desire and need for her to be the resourceful and unwavering mother, wife, daughter, and comrade in times of economic crisis. Today, the US dollar reigns as hard currency in Cuba. In July 1993, the Cuban government decriminalized the possession of US dollars in order to increase the flow of currency from for Cubans in other countries, especially in the United States, to Cubans living on the island. That flow has been impeded by the restrictions of currency exchange and travel introduced by President Clinton following the mass immigration of Cubans to Florida in the summer of 1994. At a time when the United States is becoming more stringent about the flow of Cubans and currency. Cuban allows 100,000 Cuban exiles a year to return for family visits and has opened up restrictions on travel for Cuban citizens. At a June 1994 meeting with the small international delegations at Havana, Martin Luther King Jr. Center, National Assembly President Ricardo Alarcon, who holds a position equivalent to that of the U.S. Speaker of the House, explaining that by restricting Cubans' residence in America and sending financial aid to their families on the island, the U.S. government is infringing on their human rights. Americans, residents of family members in Mexico and Canada, Jamaica and Israel, for instance, face no such restrictions. Furthermore, in 1994, Clinton's policy restricting Cubans who are traveling from the United States to the island to carry out only $100, not surprisingly, was resulted in money smuggling. Officially, the exchange rate is $1 to a peso, but the underground market in 1994 trafficked 100 to 135 pesos for a dollar. University professors earn 600 pesos a month, while the approximately 300,000 workers in the sugar industry earn 150 pesos a month, less than $2 on Havana's underground market. Certain items in the new retail stores can only be purchased with dollars, legally sold in dollar stores and illegally sold in the underground market. In the past, there were mostly luxury goods. Now they include certain foods as well as soaps and shampoos, which if cheaply purchased sells for $2 a bottle. On the September 1993, Cuban legalized self-employment in approximately 104 occupations. Self-employment for independent workers. For instance, dollar only tax drivers or those whose private cars moonlight as Romani cab constitutes a relatively affluent sector of Cuban society. It is the sector in which largely reported income goes untaxed. The National Assembly passed an economic policy program that includes the creation of tax policies and incentives for savings. Rectification and economic chaos. Is it rectification? Yeah. Hold on a second. Burping up a little bit. Just burping up a little bit. Sorry, buddy. No bad. Yeah, close enough. Before Soviet reformers initiated pre-Stroka and Glasnost under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, Cuban scholars maintain that there was the Cuban Rectification Program, quote unquote. The Third Congress of the Cuban Communist Party adopted the Rectification Program in 1986 in its own version of the opening process, whereas the new Soviet openness and the Reagan-Gorbachev rapprochement received considerable play in the U.S. press. Similar process and restructuring in Cuban garnered little attention. In this rectification period, responding to economic and social crisis, Cuban leaders began expanding their decision making and power based beyond the Communist Party and its traditionally light-skinned or white male leaders. According to economist Casanova, the Rectification Program emerged from the government's recognition in the mid-1980s that the economy needed reform. By opening up the decision-making process, rectification leaders acknowledged some of the liabilities of overly centralized bureaucratic government, which limited direct input from the community and non-party members. The program dealt with not only the economic and political structures, but also with the social inequalities based on gender and skin color that persisted in contemporary Cuba. In redressing such inequities, program officials expressed a commitment to increasing the number of women and Black Cubans in leadership. Yet because of salvaging the economy is a priority, providing equal equity for the most disenfranchised black people and women is somewhat peripheral in rectification. The democratization of Cuba, political and economic institution, does not in itself address the marginalization of women and Black people. The contemporary economic crisis has shifted the focus of economic survival, although social inequities determines who is most likely to survive at below subsistence levels. There are obviously problems and deficiencies in Cuba, social and economic policies. Some US-based intellectual writings in popular media sources are able to describe the errors and limitations of the Cuban government while acknowledging its rights to self rather than US determination. For example, S.L. Rivero Y. Mendez, a Cuban living in New York, recounts the unequal status of Cuban women and repressive treatment towards Cuban women dissidents, while critiquing the macho politics of the United States and its embargoes and impoverished Cuban people. Since the Reagan administration initiated a campaign censoring Cuba for human rights violation while simultaneously dismissing UN's human rights covenants as applicable to the United States against free speech and anti-government dissidents, Cuba has been addressing criticisms of human rights abuses such as those cited in Amnesty International's reports on prison conditions in 1996, when the Cuban military shot down to Miami commuter planes distributing anti-government leaflets. The deaths of the Cuban American pilots created a backlash that facilitated a passage of anti-Cuban legislation through Congress and Clinton's signing of the measure into law. So they were fucking sending them leaflets. They were sending them leaflets? Jesus Christ. As important as specific criticisms concerning the nation's practices are in respect to civil and human rights, generalized condemnation of Cuban from obstructing freedom of religion, democracy, construed and electoral politics based on a U.S. model. and the free market obscured Cubans' broadening policies for religious practices, elections, and economic decentralization. For example, in 1991, the Fourth Congress of the Communist Party voted to open membership to Christians and non-Marxist Leninists, devoting its past discriminatory practices. In the early 1990s, Reverend Ruel Suarez of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Havana became one of the first clergies elected to the National Assembly. According to the staff at the church's annex, Havana's Martin Luther King Jr. Center, the government increasingly seeks out religious leaders, Catholics and Protestants, as well as those in traditional African-based religions, Santeria and Palo Monto. I'm sorry, buddy, to be included in discussions and decision-making processes at local and national levels. Cuban scholars attribute the more public practices of religion in general and the growth of popular religiosity in Santeria and Pablo Monte. Now, I'm pretty sure people that know about Cuban and stuff are probably like snickering and laughing at me because I'm having to the assertions by the Fourth Congress of the importance of understanding people's needs to practice their religion, which was debated in 1993 conference commissioned on gender, race, and class by social scientists. Cuban Christianity often coexists in a syncretic form with the popular religiosity of African-based religions. For example, Havana Ebenezer Baptist Church stands adjacent to the Martin Luther King Jr. Center, where traditions Orisha dances and songs are performed by local youth maintaining their culture and religious practices in Santeria, Uriba, and Pablo Monte, Congo. Changes in 1992 electoral laws revised the system in which members of municipal assemblies elected representatives to provincial assemblies, who then in turn elected National Assembly deputies. In February 1993, Cubans held parliament elected in 1994. 83% are first-time delegates to the National Assembly, increasing the participation of youth, black people, the M word that they use for and women, as well as deputies with international work experience. While it searches for foreign capital and investment, Cuba promotes decentralized local markets in a newly economic economy struggling to survive. According to Alonso Casanova, 70% of Cuban industries are efficient, partly because of past practices of withholding decision-making power from local managers, citing inadequacies as well as present resourcefulness. Casanovas recounted how after the confiscation of idle land held by American corporations in the 1960s, Cuba found that much of that same land, when controlled by a Cuban government, was still idle and poorly managed in the 1980s. The government began to redistribute tracts among local farming cooperatives. In September 1993, the government recognized state farms, converting 75% of Cuban agriculture land into smaller cooperatives called basic units and cooperative production. Non-governmental organizations are decentralizing as well. The state-supported National Women's Organization, the, Federación de las, Mujeres Cubanas, FMC, envisioned its 1995 Sixth Congress as an informal and democratic gathering with few paper presentations, attempting to invigorate the National Women's Organizations and distance and distance past elitism. FMC delegates anticipated that the Congress would, quote, give the floor to women, let them say what they want when they want, end quote. According to the FMC representative, Ellis Argamonti, she observes that in the special period, it is difficult for women to discuss gender equality when they are trying to deal with shortages and survival, because the general struggle to meet daily needs, smaller gatherings such as Casa de las Margeries or the Consejo Popular Council, having replaced the mass rallies of the 1970s and 1980s, according to the Argamonti. I'm saying it completely wrong, everybody, which is okay, I think. Yeah, welcome back. Constructed as the erotic and exotic nation, Cuba, with its cash crops, has historically served European and American pleasures for decadence. Before the 1959 revolution, Cuba signified ultimate, unlimited, and unpoliced consumption of rum during the Prohibition, commercial sex, and gambling for those inclined for more respectable and legal pleasures. It traded in the above ground markets of sugar, tourism, and cigars. Afro-Cuban dance and music provided the exotic allure of culture, primitivism for consumers in both the underground and legal economies. To satisfy America and European desires for they use a color that's very, very dark, exotica, Cuban markets expanded to include the bodies of women and children in prostitution. Today, tourism has created new cash crops. The island itself is nativism of its culture, as well as the skills and performance of its people. Cuba's highly trained labor force has produced the most overqualified tourism personnel in the world. Increasingly professionals, particularly those proficient in English, leaving their jobs as academics, lawyers, and concert musicians, for instance, to work as tour guides. In short, tourism is an appealing field as the only industry that guarantees success to foreigners. In other words, success to dollar carriers. Tourism in Cuba is largely about marketing desires and sales, quote, island eros to non-islanders. Although not yet economically profitable, tourism is viewed as a key to Cuba's economic future. The industry generates 34 cents for each dollar spent. As Alonso Casanova put it, the Cuban government spends 66 cents to acquire 34 cents as an investment. It seems promising because of the fixed market. Further, a barter system based on the relative stability of Cuban's position is the embodiment of the European American imagery of they use color eros. Currently, the primary investors in Cuba tourism are from Western Europe. Cuban economic planners are involved in joint ventures in hotels and emerging private beaches at Verandeiro and other sites with corporations in Canada, Spain, Germany, Italy, and Mexico. The historic symbol of Cuban independence, the Hotel Havana, La Brea, was leased in the early 1990s to Spanish investors. With European and Canadian money come new sensibilities around labor and racial and sexual politics. rumors circulating in Havana intimate. Let me make sure. I'm second guessing on an easy freaking word. Hold on a second, I gotta find the word again. Fucking lost my fucking spot. I lost my spot. Quarantines foreigners, carry dollars, island euros, blah blah blah. 40 cents, got that. Oh my gosh, I am so far behind. Hold on. Jesus. There it is. Found it. Right back. I couldn't say intimate. Jesus Christ. My bad. Havana's intimate that Cubans joint ventures hotels under new management and restructuring discipline their workers. Reassigning the terminating employees. I have to say this, sorry. Darker skinned Cubans are reportedly moved from front desks to back kitchens or even let go. On the consumer side of the market, African American tourists, male and female, are questioned when entering hotel lobbies as either potential pimps or prostitutes, whereas their white North American counterparts are not bothered by plainclothes security guards, doormen, and desk clerks. In the context of white desires and design on dark Cuban sexual objectifications and exploitation reflect the stereotypes of anti-black racism. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the sex trade. The sex industry is an integral part of the north-south tourism. Historically, the island has catered to the taste of non-natives. Before the 1959 revolution, there were 100,000 prostitutes in Cuba, an estimate 10% of the female workforce, according to the Federación de las Mujeres Cubanas. Abolished in Cuba, prostitution has visibly reappeared in economy's dependency on tourism during the special periods. According to Esla Argamanti, the FMC focused on education rather than criminalizing prostitutes and polarizing women, following the theory that, quote, all of us need all of us, end quote, and that, quote, the survival of the people at dignified levels of subsistence are important to us, end quote. The emerging prostitution trade linked to tourism. European and Canadian tourists seem to prefer black teenage girls, while Latin American tourists prefer white Cubans, as Acevedo Cardenesa from El Centurio para, I can't say this, sorry everybody, Estudios de los Estudios Endos observed in June 1993. Sorry everybody. This claim is statistically indeterminate, but consistent with the exoticized concept of others. The exoticized concept of others. Cubans and non-Cubans argue rather more gentaras or jockeys, the majority of whom are not engaged in prostitution, are dark-skinned or black. Black Cubans such as Pedro Perez, Sandy, co-editor of AFRO Afro-Cuba, assert that disproportionately they are. The association of blackness with criminality and prostitution appears in socialist policies. The social belief that the majority of, oh my gosh, I'm going to look up this word. It's GENETERAS, are dark-skinned Cubans. Fueled old racial prejudice of black harlots, or the counter-revolutionary as white Cuban academics in discussions at University of Havana in June 1993 described such girls and women. In the reverse, some dark-skinned Cubans preferred the company of whites. Cardenas, who is the father of a dark-skinned teenage girl, has noted that black Cuban girls are often in awe of European and American men. They are dazzled not only by dollars, but also by the essential wealth of men with white skin. For girls who model the antithesis of the European defined beauty, attentions from the white man means a mere desire and a status of being desirable, sometimes augmented by a trinket or a meal, or ample payment for socializing and or sex. Prostitution is only the most valuable form of sexual objectification of Cuban people and culture. Sexual objectification is also evident in media representations. For example, consider the New York Times Magazine 1993 travel articles on, quote, sun and sin in Cuba, end quote, which features photographs of Copacabana dancers in plumage and nipple tassels, as well as beach photos of white European men sitting in a chaise lounge facing the camera with his hand on the bare G-string bottom of his black companion, who lies face down in an adjoining lounge chair. The fully clothed image of the alluring feminized Cuba also appeared in progressive publications such as Cuba Update, which in 1994 features its back cover a photo of three young women strolling together as a macho Cubana version of Charlie's Angels. Not only the feminine is represented with seductive allure in U.S. culture. The eroticized masculine Cuba is also peddled in the United States from the goofy green wannabe Latin lover played by Jim Carrey in The Mask to a woman's magazine in which editors warn their largely white affluent females readers of the seductive powers of the Cuban head of state and ironically demonized Fidel. Erotically demonized Fidel. Among women, the representation of the eroticized revolutionary surface in the most unlikely of sites, for instance, in 1988, Women's Anti-Intervention Conference. In 1988, I joined 2,000 women who traveled to Havana to participate in the women's, Encuentro organized by the FMC on North American intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean. The meeting drew indigenous, black, trade unionist movement leaders, as well as white, affluent Latin American women. In the opening session, presided over the FMC, headed by Vilma Espin, President Fidel Castro's addressed the delegates discussing the international debt crisis as well as toxic waste and garbage dumped by the United States on developing world sites. At a closing reception, he appeared with the routine of mostly male cabinet members, Latinas and white Latinas from Argentina, Chile, mobbed Castro, following him like Eurasians, groupies, as he attempted to greet each national delegation of women. Castro eventually retreated to the dignitaries' meeting rooms, and the women and their unruly behavior were locked out. Oh my gosh. There, he met with small delegations, including Native American women from the United States and women active in Latin America and Cuba liberation movements. One FMC member bitterly remarked to a small group of U.S. delegates that the mobbing women would never have greeted another head of state, say the president of Argentina, with such disrespect. Yet her expression of disgust for the white Latinas who exoticized and racialized Castro was contradicted by the desire seen in the face of other Cuban women. For instance, earlier in the day, non-elite, non-FMC women opened their houses for a tour of Cuban homes. One woman seemed mesmerized by a well-to-do Argentinian's waist-length blonde hair and blowing white ankle-length summer dress as she stepped across the doorway. During a night of block parties, small delegations of women gathered in neighborhoods throughout Havana. There was a delegation from the United States, including mostly African women and Native American women, some of whom have been radical activists in black liberation movements in the 1970s, and a few who targeted for their work by the state had been incarcerated as political prisoners. Early in the evening, we heard rumors of that Castro would honor attendees with his presence. For progressive women who were often politically isolated, some had been detained in the United States or in more dangerous sites such as El Salvador and Guatemala. A visit from President Castro was considered an auspicious sign to U.S. radical black and indigenous women, because they used the color. It was not oft that a head of state financed and attended a party in their honor. When Castro appeared, he made a short speech of greeting and soon departed after shaking hands with African and Native American women delegates. As his entourage departed, the eyes of most African American women were not focused on Castro, as they might have been in the reception. Rather, they gazed at his male military attendants. The men guarding Castro that night were black, ebony, dark-skinned Cubans. Their Stanisqua militarism for some upstaged Castro, particularly in their departure. They ran abreast and behind the sedan, entering it two by two, looking over their shoulders in the elegant run dance. Their image was shockingly different from that of Secret Service agents in being raincoats jogging alongside Reagan's or Bush's limousines in that era. It is possible that the women's desire was inspired by only romantic eros. It seems to be something more, echoing that their foremothers and fathers must have felt on seeing the People of Color Battalion and guarded Abraham Lincoln or the first African American troops, nurses, camps, aides, and in the Civil War. These African American women were transfixed by the amigo of black resistance, rather than focus on the heterosexual fetish that this eros seems filtered through the the colors of black liberation. Such eros allows more than one woman. The eros allowed more than one woman radical to see herself in the departing soldiers and to see in Castro and his entourage the embodiment of private and politicized desire for radical anti-racist resistance and national liberation. Political eros, nationalism, anti-racism, and anti-imperialism. See how this goes. Cuba has no system of classifying race. The island's inhabitants refer to themselves as Cuban rather than Afro-Cubans or Asian Cubans. Yet there is recognition and identification as whites, and they use the M word, but it's half white, half black, or black Cuban, with social realities that reflect the hierarchies of these racial relationships. The census classifies Cubans as white or black. In the 1980s Cuban census, for example, 70% of Cubans were identifying as white and 30% as non-white. That is, quote, the M word, the M word, not the ones that half black, half white, or black. Although it is likely to reverse. Only the minority of Cubans are a purely European descent. In the absence of classified race, skin color becomes the marker of racism. According to researchers Pablo Rodriguez, Paulo Anquandaro, and Ana J. Garcia Lazara, and Carazana, and Lourdes Sereno, there are more marriages between social economic classes than between racial groups. They identified the latter groups as whites, Mextas. I don't know if this is indigenous or people from India, but I'll say indigenous just for right now. And Spanish, or African and Spanish. Half black, half white people, and black people. In a debate during the 1993 Conference Commission on Gender, Race, and Class, this question was raised. Oh my gosh. They said it in Spanish, but I'm going to say it. What is mixed in Cuba? That's the question mark. Rodriguez and his colleagues answered, quote, a mystery. Some felt that it was more accurate to speak of skin color rather than race. The aesthetics of beauty and racism. But in a society where white presence have dark children and, oh my gosh, I can't say these dang words, half black, half white, giving birth to whites, as one woman gave the example of her darker skinned husband and their lighter skinned sons. The concept of race is much more fluid. Castro, for example, describes Cuba as an Afro-Cuban culture. Many Cubans, like their U.S. counterparts, assert that only the right wing of conservatives talks about race in biological terms, and yet many claim to have a dark-skinned grandmother in the kitchen or closet, but fail to explain why she is cloistered there. In Cuba, nationality and ethnicity are not synonymous, even among Latin Americans as among North Americans. Ethnicity and skin color influence social and family life. Darker-skinned females and poor Cubans benefit greatly from the economic and social policies adopted after 1956 revolution. These same groups, however, are most adversely affected by the U.S. embargoes and economic crisis of a special period. As in the United States, increasing economic hardship fuel racism, even in the absence of quantified races. Black Cubans observe that in the society where people are no longer fearful of a weakening government and committees for the defense of the revolution, they more openly express anti-government as well as racist sentiments censured by the state. Overt expressions of racism in Cuba do not approximate the resurgence of neo-Nazi and hate groups in former Eastern Bloc states, which had outlawed racist and anti-Semitic speech and organizing. Occupying the poorer strata of society with few family members in North America, the little access to dollar, Black Cubans lack material supplies. In this way, dollars increase the racial stratification of Cuba society. Acknowledging that Cuba's need for hard currency brings new problems. National Assembly President Ricardo Alarcon has pointed out that his neighbor, who did not necessarily support the revolution and maintain friendly ties with Miami relatives, ate better and could provide for his family better than he who had no conduit for American dollars. Stratification is not restricted to race, but is exacerbated by it. Still, Black Cubans say that because they are the poorest sector are used to struggling with impoverishment, they complain the least. The contrast, the urban Cuban middle class, which is experiencing the greatest decline in material standards of living, are often more vocal in their complaints. Despite its social problems and its own colonial hangovers of anti-Black prejudice, Cuba is noted for being one of the most racially progressive countries in the Americas. To anti-racist U.S. citizens, Cuba represents a social and economic model that places human concerns before profit, supporting decolonization struggles and condemning racism. For instance, U.S. progressive Edwin and Joanne Hoffman noted Cuban significance to those struggling in a racially and economically stratified United States. The contrast between the profound living levels of racism in our country and the essential egalitarianism in Cuba cannot be dismissed. Cuba has nothing like the oppression of Black people living in our inner cities. The challenges of joblessness, houselessness, drug addiction, and gang wars, violence and police brutality, high rates of morbidity and mortality, a failed school system. That's the end of that statement. Cuba's commitment have included supporting exiled African Americans from the Black liberation movements and independencia of Puerto Rican liberation struggles in the 1960s and 1970s, such as Assata Shakur and other political prisoners. For many American progressives during that period, being in solidarity with Cuba was a commitment to racial inequalities and economic justice. Cuba's appeal, particularly to radicals, continued because it provided personnel and material resources in international struggles for socialist and anti-racist states and movements. Cuba's stature among anti-imperialists and radical anti-racists is partly based on its foreign policy commitments. During its period of economic prosperity and stability, Cuba spent considerable resources supporting decolonizations and independent struggles in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Southern Africa. The Nicaraguan Sandinistas, Salvadorian FMLE, the PLO, the ANC, the Namibians, SWAPO, all benefited from Cuban educators, medical technicians, engineers, and other support. Such support did not greatly endear it to the United States, which subsidized the military in El Salvador, the Contras in Nicaragua, the Southern Africa and South Africa apartheid regimes, Israeli occupation of Palestine. Each of these racialized struggles was fought to some degree symbolically and literally against economic domination of racism. The disapproval of Cuba's support of liberation movements even reverberated into U.S. mayoral politics. In 1990, Miami's mayor, Cuban-born Xavier Suarez, refused to meet with Nelson Mandela, touring the United States after 27 years as a South African politician, prisoner because of Mandela's meeting with Castro and Cuba's decades-long support of the ANC. That Suarez was the only U.S. mayor to snub Mandela may reflect not only his foreign policies stance as a Cuban exile, but also as a local activist contended the racist politics of Cuban immigrants. In contrast to the often tensions, relations between Miami African descendant and largely white Cuban population, relations exacerbated by anti-black policy, police brutality, and the immigration and naturalization service previous policies of welcoming Cuban immigrants as political refugees and dispatching Haitians as economic refugees. There have been decades of progressive alliance between African Americans and Cuban nationals. Although more brown and black Cubans live in Miami since the Morel boat lift in the 1980s and the increasing exodus of darker skinned Cubans, the city's Cuban population still manifests as and considers itself to be white, middle class, and conservative, particularly in respect to U.S. foreign policies towards Cuba. Lisa Brock notes the ties of Black Americans to the island. This is her quote. Long before 1959, Cubans and African Americans had forged working relationships. Abolitionists jointly formed organizations. Leftists and trade unionists exchanged strategies. And journalists, novelists, and poets aroused multi-sensibilities. On a mass level, musicians and baseball players actually shared the same culture, venues, entertaining millions and regular black folk in Cuba and in the United States. When the Cuban Revolution culminated, the 1959, most black people applauded its success. All right, that was it. That was that part. Now let's go back to this. Since 1959, revolution, according to Brock, the connection between African Americans and Cuban have been strained by the blockade, as well as racial polarization and anti-black racism among white Cuban exiles. Particularly historic events have emphasized the interrelations between revolutionary black nationalism in the United States and revolutionary Cuban nationalism, undergirding these ties and African American desires for an independent Cuba. The momentous episode, one promoting such coalitions, crystallized the 1960s with Castro's visit to Harlem and his meeting with Malcolm X. The September 24th, 1960 meeting between the two leaders documented in Rosemary Malley's Fidel and Malcolm X was a brief but important encounter that strengthened the bond between progressive African Americans and progressive Cubans. This Encentro also became a symbol of resistance to imperialism, white supremacy. Ironically, the meeting occurred at the instigation of the U.S. State Department, much to its chagrin, which had pressured the Shalibarn Hotel to cancel accommodation for the Cuban delegation headed by Castro. Having successfully waged a revolution for independence within the U.S. sphere of influence, the Cubans who were scheduled to participate in international meetings at the United Nations were harassed by U.S. government during their stay. At the suggestions of Harlem activists, the disruption in accommodations was transformed into a culture of political expressions of solidarity and anti-racism. When the Cuban delegation accepted the warm welcome of the hotel, Teresa owner Love B. Woods would relocate to Harlem. Ideological and political ties between progressive African Americans and Cuban revolutionaries were cultivated. In Fidel and Malcolm X recording, both men reflected on their meeting, mainly quotes Malcolm X observation that quote, the Teresa is now best known as the place where Fidel Castro went during his UN visit and achieved a psychological coup over the United States Department when it confined him to Manhattan, never dreaming that he'd stay uptown in Harlem and make such an impression among black people. At the December 13th, 1964 meeting, where he discussed Che Guevara's aborted visit to Harlem, a visit canceled in response to anti-revolutionary Cuban and U.S. Americans, Malcolm X repeated his assertion. With characteristics defiance, Malcolm X prefaced his reading of the note from Guevara, in which the Argentinian explained the reason for his absence. By warning the gathering, quote, don't let anybody tell us who our enemy should be and who our friends should be, quote, in Melee 59. Referring to Guevara's, Malcolm X said, quote, I love a revolutionary, and one that the most revolutionary men in this country right now was going to come out here, end quote. Advocating African American independency from the U.S. government's policies on Cuba, Malcolm X and his resistance to anti-black racism fused contemporary black radicalism and solidarity work with Cuba. You don't see any anti-Castro Cubans around here. We eat them up. We eat them up. Let them go and fight the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizen Council. Let them spend some of that energy getting their own house in order. Don't come up to Harlem and tell us who we should applaud for, who shouldn't, and who for applaud for and shouldn't applaud for. Or there will be some anti-Castro Cubans. And that's the end of that. 25 years later, the assassination of Malcolm X at the May 1990 symposium, quote, Malcolm X speaks in the 1990s. Castro reminisced about his meetings with the radical leader in Harlem. And here's what he says. I always recalled my meeting with Malcolm X at the Hotel Teresa because he was the one who supported us and made it possible for us to stay there. We faced two alternatives. One was the United Nations Gardens. When I mentioned this to the Secretary General, he was horrified at the thought of the delegation in tents there. But when we received Malcolm X's offer, he had spoken with one of our comrades, and I said, that is a place, that is the place, the Hotel Teresa, end quote. And there we went. So I have a personal recollection, very much linked to him, quote, in Malaise 61. Castro's reflection illustrated Cuba's attraction to progressive black people and radicals, and how a small island nation came to symbolize resistance to a state constructed as an imperial behemoth. Obviously, to some degree, the attraction also revolved around the Black Eros. Although sometimes romanticized, the Eros is not necessarily a sexualized sensibility, for it is connected to Cuban culture, strong roots of political resistance, as well as African music, dance, and religion. The Vencessimos Brigade, historic African American Christian delegation, Pastors for Peace, studied and exchanged delegations on Afro-Cuban culture. Women's and academic delegations all have provided opportunities for Black Americans to encounter Cuba. For nearly 4 decades, there has been an audience of progressives and non-progressives attentive to the words of Cuban socialists, communists, and the Cuban head of state. For progressive African Americans and anti-racists, This focus and sometimes fascination intensified when Castro departed from the position of most heads of state towards radically oppressed, racially oppressed U.S. minorities, makes declarations of solidarity such as those impressed in his symposium speech. And I think there's some of it right here. We have always been in solidarity with the struggles of Black people, of minorities, and of the poor in the United States. We have always been in solidarity with them, and they have been in solidarity with us. We must fight to defeat the campaigns and the schemes that and the lies, all that is aimed at separating us. I think that in these times, we need that friendship more than ever. We need your solidarity more than ever. And we fully appreciate it, because we understand that has to be very courageous to support Cuba in the United States. The bond between Cubans and Black Americans no longer appears as close. The unraveling of this connection is a byproduct of Black conservatism and the special period. Some Cubans have privately stated that in the era of economic crisis, they see African Americans as wielding little economic and political power in the United States, and the powerful the political allies and capital are what Cuban desperately need at the moment. This perception and powerlessness on the part of poor and ethnically oppressed peoples who desires an agency are thought to be nullified by the state. It contested by more radical Cubans. Conclusion. See where we're at. I think we're going to do a conclusion. Yeah, conclusion, and we'll be done. Conclusion. On November 18th, 1994, National Assembly President Alarcón became the first Cuban official to speak at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Since Castro's appearance in 1959 in the C-SPAN televised address, Alarcón reiterated the long-standing statement by Cuban officialdom. As long as Cuba suffers the threat of foreign intervention, it will follow the assertion of its historic leader, Castro Manuel D. Zapatas, I can't say his name, that a unified party is necessary for the sovereign and independent state, reminding the audience and media viewers that the U.S. could not dictate Cubans' political, economic, and social affairs. Alarcón said that Cuba is simply not a U.S. colony. American desires built around Cuba swing from reactionary and conservative designs of destabilization and neo-colonial economic dependencies, radical and liberal hopes for the sovereignty of the socialist state. The United States has spent tens of millions of dollars funding anti-socialist Cuban organizations such as the Radio Marti and several Miami-based organizations. It has also circumvented international law by implementing the embargoes and punitive measures against other nations that trade with Cuba. Despite U.S. investments against Cuba independency, it is still uncertain whether former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's assertions about dominance, that power is the greatest I can't say this damn word. I'm gonna one more word. Riadak. Oh my gosh, it's aphrodisiac. Sorry. Aphrodisiac is a former reflection of U.S. state eros, capable of crippling Cuban sovereignty. What is clear, however, is that Cubans' effort, aided by U.S. solidarity groups, to chart its own economic and social development continued among contemporary revolutionaries who, in some accordance with their head of state, assert national aspirations and international obligation. America desires for Cuba are framed by the word of Castro's quote in Fidel and Malcolm X. Cuba has an important role to play, a very big responsibility, because there were people who thought that the revolution here would collapse, just like socialism in Europe. But of course, this country will resist. We are waging 3 great battles: a political battle for the support of the people, the economic battle, the battle of defense. We have to work in these 3 directions. But we are not doing this ourselves. We are doing it for all the just cause of the world at a time of skepticism, optimism, and the hope of the people's will be born, because the negative forces will not prevail. And we'll end there. And then we'll talk about, this is border crossing alliances. Japanese, African American women in the state household. In the state's household. Interesting. That was a good thing. I like that. That was really good about Cuba and about what's going on and why they had, like, what conditions was caused by the embargoes and sanctions. You know, we ended up at page 119. All right, and like how, like, oh my gosh, what happened? Did I say 119? Please tell me I said 119. Hold on, I lost my page. Come on. 10 more pages to go. About the circumstances and stuff like that, and what made them have to change up things in order to be able to fix things, and like what kind of conditions drove them to harsher conditions, and like some of the things that they missed and stuff like that. And like it had some criticism, but it also had some good things too about it too, because nothing is perfect. So like all these conditions, I feel like, are brought to you by the U.S. embargoes and sanctions that create these conditions in the first place for them to have to be able to do that. No, 119. Yeah, I think we started in 79. I'm not sure. So, yeah. And this is a good book. I like how it's going over Latin America a little bit more, which I enjoy, which I have lack of knowledge in. I have little knowledge in there. I have little knowledge in a lot of things, honestly. So, go figures.
Walaikum.
Alaikum salam. So, I have a lot of lack of knowledge, to be honest with you. Let's see here. Yeah, we started at 97. Pretty good. Pretty good. And it talks to yeah. So it's good. It went over like during Batista's time and what it did, and it went over towards the different times that people were trying to come from Cuba, being destabilized and stuff like that, and what conditions it caused and why, you know. And all we can do is have hopes for Cuba, and hopefully Cuba can stay strong. And that way we can get rid of this imperialist U.S. That'd be great. It'd help Cuba's progress a little bit more, and other places' progresses too. But anyways, I don't know how good I can answer questions, if I can at all. But if does anybody have any questions before I close? This book is good. Hi. Mm-hmm. You're a good boy. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You're a good boy. All right, then. No, 97. 97 was it. Wow. People came in and did that. That's awesome. Thank you for gifting them. I appreciate that. Thank you for gifting. Since no one has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and close it down. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening.